right, so let's talk a little bit about the Greek article. And let me just start by talking about English. What's the difference in English between saying a God and the God? Clearly, in English, a God just means any God, one among many. I don't really know who I'm talking about, but just any God. But the God has to do with a definite God that we all somehow, in the context, know who I'm talking about. And we might call that definitizing. I'm making it definite who I'm talking about. However, that's not how the Greek article works, or at least the article does do that, but it does a lot of other things too, and it functions a little bit differently. So, what does the article do? And I've adapted this from Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. So, Wallace suggests that the first thing that the article does is conceptualize something. I might think of that almost as giving us a handle that we can use to pick up a concept. We'll see some more details, we'll see some examples, but let's just start with the idea of the Greek article saying, boy, there's this thing I want to talk about. And right now it's a little bit vague and it doesn't have good borders. But if I put an article in front of it, that's going to let me pick up this concept and talk to you about it. Now, the second thing an article does is it identifies. We saw a little bit of that a minute ago. It identifies which of many things I'm talking about. Maybe it identifies which concept I'm talking about. Maybe it identifies which of many human beings I'm talking about. Maybe it identifies which of many gods I'm talking about, but it identifies. And then finally, the third thing that it does do is it definitizes. It tells us which of the things of the generic concept, which of those specifically I'm talking about. Now, there's another approach to articles that's different from Wallace's, and I wanted to tell you about it because I find it really intriguing. It comes from a book written in 2014 by Ronald Peters called The Greek Article, A Functional Grammar of Ho Items in the Greek New Testament, with special emphasis on the Greek article. And in order to explain that book to you, I'm going to give you an example of a translation using what Ronald Peters suggests is the one meaning or function of the Greek article. So let me show you that just a minute here. So here we have 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 through 8, translated using Peter's concept of the Greek article. Now, for Peter's, which is different from Wallace, for Peter's, he believes that the Greek article comes from the relative pronoun. And so you're going to see that in all these cases, the articles are translated something like a relative pronoun. And I've underlined the translations of the article so that you can see how this works. As for the rest, therefore, brothers and sisters, we ask and urge you in the Lord Jesus that just as you received from us what it is that is how you must live and please God, do you see how that article, in this case, it kind of does function as a handle to pick up how you must live and please God, this vague concept. Well, now I put an article in front of it so I can pick it up and tell you about it. But you also see here that it's constructed like a relative pronoun. Just as you also are doing, so that you would progress more. For you know what instructions we gave you through he who is the Lord Jesus Christ. For this is the will of he who is God, who is your sanctification, that you abstain from that which is sexually immoral, that each one of you know how to control what is his own body with holiness and honor, not in the passion of lust, just as even those who are Gentiles, those who do not know he who is God, what it is not to transgress and wrong the one who is his brother in what is this matter, because the Lord is an avenger in all these things, just as we also told you beforehand and solemnly testify. For the one who is God has not called us for impurity, but in holiness. Therefore, the one who rejects this rejects not a human, but the one who is God, the one who gives, the one who is his spirit, who is holy for you. Now, that's an expansive translation, and none of us really want a translation of the Bible that adds all those words. But I just wanted to give you a brief snapshot of Peter's approach to articles in case you want to pursue that further. Now, let's go back to see how Wallace does it. So Wallace suggests that there are all these various meanings, and looking at these meanings is very much like analyzing the participles, sorry. There's nothing in the grammar that's going to distinguish these different uses of the article, but these are ways to analyze what is it that the article means in this passage. How is the article helping to communicate here? And so let me explain these various categories. So first of all, when it's used with a substantive, because the other sort of category is that articles can be used as relative pronouns, just as Peters suggests. But when it's not, so sorry, Peters says they're all basically relative pronouns. Wallace says, no, 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 some of them are relative pronouns because we can't do anything else with them. But if they're with a substantive, then here's what we do. So he says some of the articles are just there for simple identification. We're talking about the bowl, not any bowl, but the one we have here. And deictic is a subcategory of simple identification because deictic is the bowl that I'm pointing at, the bowl. And we use the article as sort of a way with words to point at the bowl that we're having a conversation about. Now, that may be all that's going on. But besides just identification, we might be identifying something in a specific way. And so these categories, that's why they're in concentric circles, because an anaphoric use of an article is also a simple identification, but it's more detailed than that. So that's the concentric circles here. We may have an article that's then also specifically identifying the thing we're talking about because it's the one we've already mentioned. Anaphoric means the one I told you about there. So I might say a boy goes to the store, and when he gets there, the boy, and Greek does that too. At first, it was any boy. I might use tis in Greek. But later on, when I mention the boy, well, this is the boy, you already know which boy I'm talking about because I've already told you about him. And so it's anaphoric. By the way, sometimes it happens that an article is used and I haven't yet told you which one I'm talking about, but I'm going to in a few minutes, and that's cataphoric. Hopefully you recognize the prefixes on those words, even in English. Now, it might be the one we've already talked about in this text, but it might be even more than that. It might be the one, and you know which one I'm talking about because this one is so well known. It's something everybody knows about. So if I say the God in a certain context, in English, I might not use the article. I might just say God with a capital G, but in Greek, I'm going to use the article because it's the God of the New Testament that we've been talking about this whole time. And you know who I'm talking about. And I know who I'm talking about because they're so well known. Same thing with maybe Paul. I might use an article because it's not just any Paul, but I don't have to explain which Paul it is. It's the Paul we all know. Now, more than well known, it might be par excellence, and par excellence comes from French, and it means the greatest one. So here it might be, I might use an article to talk about the day, and a lot of times Greek just says he hemera, and it doesn't bother to explain which day we're talking about. But when the New Testament talks about the day, we all know it's at the eschatological day. It's the end of time. It's that day, the greatest day, the day par excellence. Um, More than par excellence, it might be a monadic use, which means there's only one. So when I talk about the sun, I'm going to use the article, but I'm not using the article because you're going to get confused about which sun I'm talking about if it's the one in the sky, S-U-N, not S-O-N. There's only one. So I'm identifying it for you. And if we go down the categories, it is simple identification. I'm telling you which sun I'm talking about. It's also anaphoric. It's a sun we've talked about before. It's well known, certainly. The sun is very well known. It is the sun par excellence. It's the greatest one in its category, but it's also monadic. There is the only one sun that we ever talk about. We might also be pointing to an abstract thing that we are conceptualizing. So again, this is that sense that we are providing a handle with which to pick up an abstract idea. Salvation. Now, this is another one that usually doesn't take an article in English. When I talk about salvation in English, I don't say the salvation. That sounds odd in English. But in Greek, Greek takes an article with salvation because it's identifying the salvation that we have talked about before, that is well known, that is the greatest salvation. It's not the only one, but it is abstract. And so it's going to be an abstract use. There's also a category that Wallace doesn't include in his chart here, which is the category of generic. And that's simple identification, but for a class of people. Wallace gives the example of Romans 13:4. He doesn't bear the sword in vain. The sword doesn't mean any particular sword, but it means sword as a class, as opposed to, say, flowers. And so that's the idea there. Now, Wallace also provides this flowchart, if you like flowcharts, that helps you to decide what is the use of the article. And remember, first, this has to be an article used with a substantive, and then we use the chart. And again, this is about figuring out the meaning of the passage. You're not going to have any trouble translating it, but this is, if you want to, part of the point of learning Greek is to think through the details of the meaning of the text. And if there's an article that seems odd to you and you want to better understand what is going on with this article and what it's communicating and why the author added an article here. Or if you just want to dig deeper into a text and it seems like a pretty obvious text that you've read 1,000 times and you're looking for new insights, analyzing the participles, of course, and then analyzing the articles are two really good ways to get down into the weeds of the text and try to understand it better. But again, both of these, analyzing participles and as far as what they mean and their adverbial meaning, and analyzing articles in this way, there's no right or wrong answer as far as the grammar is concerned. There's going to be several good answers and also some answers that are just not going to work because of the context. And you can have disagreements about that. So let's kind of go through this and imagine that we have an article and we're trying to figure out what it's doing. We're going to start up here. And of course, it has a substantive with it, a noun or an adjective, something like that. And so the first question is, does it distinguish class from class, like swords from flowers? If yes, then it's a generic article and you're done. If it doesn't, then you're going to ask if it distinguishes an individual thing from another individual thing. If it doesn't, then it's probably not used with a substantive. So you want to look at the ways that articles can be used as pronouns, as relative pronouns, etc. But if it does distinguish an individual from an individual, then you're going to ask yourself, well, maybe this is the anaphoric use. Does it refer to a noun mentioned previously in the context or mentioned previously elsewhere? If it does, you're going to continue to try to kind of drill down to more details. If it doesn't, you're going to then ask, well, if it's not something we've already mentioned, is it something that's here with the speaker that the speaker might be sort of pointing to as he talks? If it's not, or if it is, then it's a deictic article. If it's not, now we have two no's. It's not been mentioned before, and it's not present at the time of speaking. So all we can do is go back to this general simple identification. We're just identifying which one it is, but there's no specific way we're identifying which one it is. Now, if it's yes, does refer to a noun that's been mentioned previously, then we have to ask, well, is the person or thing well known? If it's not, then it's just an anaphoric use and we don't have to ask anymore. But if it is, then we can go down one more and we can ask, well, is the person or thing the best or worse of a class? If it's not, again, then we just go back to, well, it's the well-known use. It's just a well-known thing that we're identifying. But if it's not only well-known, but it's the best or worst of a class, then we can keep asking questions. If it is, then we have to ask if it's the only one of its class, like the sun. If it is, then it's monadic. If it's not, then we have to ask another question before we go back to par excellence. We have to ask whether the noun is an abstract quality. So if it's not the only one of its class and it's not an abstract quality, then it's just the best or worst of a class and it's par excellence. But if it is an abstract quality, although not the only one, then we say, well, it's the abstract use. So it's just a method to think through the meaning of the article and um, drill down a little bit. Now, it is important to ask that question. Does the article have a semantic use or does it have a functional use? And those are not mutually exclusive. Articles can do both, but one or the other is probably primary. And so sometimes it's the function that's primary. When it's the function that's primary, it can be used as a substantiver of adverbs. We've seen this with prepositions to the other side, right? But here we have ekton kato, so from the places below. And we've taken, well, John has taken an article and put it in front of this adverb and created a substantive from it, from the places below. And so here we're not going to necessarily go through that chart to figure out what use it is, because what this has just done is it's given John a way to talk about below as a thing. Same thing with ekton ano. And here you have those adverbs that I was talking about when I mentioned cataphoric and anaphoric above and below. We can also use articles. Greek can also use articles as a substantiver of verbs. We saw this, I think it was in chapter 18 maybe, where we have kathisai, to de kathisai, and the to substantizes this verb. So, but to sit, or we might translate it, but the sitting at my right hand or my left hand is not mine to give. So this article has taken this, what is normally a verb, but it's turned it into a substantive. Just a quick review of attributive positions and the ways that the article is used with adjectives and nouns. We have the first attributive position. That's where we have article, adjective, noun, the holy city, and they're all the same case and number. The second attributive position is article, noun, article, adjective, or article, noun, article, participle. In both cases, everything is the same gender number case, and the adjective modifies the noun, the Holy Spirit. And here it's the sown word. We could technically translate it this exactly the same way because it's exactly the same function. It's just that English doesn't quite work that way. So we have to say something like the word which was sown. And here again, you see how closely connected the article is to a relative pronoun because we're using a relative pronoun in English as well as the me verb to translate this phrase. The third attributive position we don't talk about much, but it exists. We sometimes have adjective, article, noun. Again, all gender, number, case. I'm sorry, noun, article, adjective, the good king. Two rules that you should know about. I don't know that we talked about them, although Duff might have mentioned them in your first Greek classes. We have Apollonius's canon and corollary. So here, what the rule is that usually when there's a head noun with a genitive noun, they're either both articular or both are anarthrous. In other words, they usually either both have articles or both don't have articles. And that's less about whether the article is being used with a specific meaning or not. It has to do with the way the language functions. Now, when they are both anarthrous, in other words, when they don't have an article, they can still be definite. They can be indefinite or not. So an example is hohuios tou theou. Notice here, these are not all the same gender number case. We have the head noun is hohuios, and the noun that modifies it is tou theou in the genitive. And notice that hohuios tou theou, both nouns have the article. Here we have pneuma theou, again, nominative noun and then genitive noun. So the Spirit of God, but the Spirit of God is pretty definite. We're not vague about who this is. And so in this case, the lack of article doesn't take away from the definiteness of the construction. And this and the next rule become important for John 1:1. The other rule is Caldwell's rule. I'm going to post the article about Caldwell's rule so that you can read it for yourself. But his conclusion is that the following rules may be tentatively formulated to describe the use of the article with definite predicate nouns in sentences in which the verb occurs. And the verb he's referring to is a me usually, but it's any verb that can have a predicate. So note that he's talking only about definite nouns, nouns that we already know are definite. Let's say God in the Bible. There's only one God that it's talking about. It's very definite who it's talking about. We don't have to wonder. The noun is definite. How does it work? Well, definite predicate nouns regularly take the article. Most of the time, a definite noun in a predicate construction with the me verb, for example, is going to take an article. However, there are exceptions, and when there are exceptions, it's usually due to a change in word order. Definite predicate nouns which come after the verb, and that's the usual order, they usually take the article. However, when definite predicate nouns precede the verb, come more at the beginning of the sentence, certainly before the me verb, they often lack the article. They're still definite, but they often lack the article. Also, proper names regularly lack the article when they're in the predicate. And then finally, predicate nominatives in relative clauses regularly follow the verb, whether or not they have the article. So relative clauses work a little bit differently. I've given you the article. If you want examples and to know more about that, you can read that on your own. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening.